folks, Scott Sigrist. Before we get into the modern political theorist, I thought it would be helpful to say a few words about modernity. So, this lecture is about modernity, what we mean by that, the significance of the modern as opposed to the pre-modern. Um, when we talk about modern political theorists, we the term modern there presupposes some difference and some fundamental difference from the non-modern. So the term modern, what does that really mean? The first thing is that it implies a periodization of history. There is the modern period, which is the later period, and there are early periods, right? The term modern is used in three different ways, really. One of them commonplace, the other two technical. The commonplace meaning is just the average person, when they say modern, they just think a vague sense of recent, last few decades, something like that, and associate it usually with the latest technologies, the latest trends, and so forth. Those of us like me who grew up before smartphones, for example, boy, that seems ancient to kids nowadays, that kind of thing. The two technical meanings are, one is, by technical I mean the meanings that scholars will use. The first is the period roughly starting in the early 20th century, a lot of times using World War I as a dividing line, because World War I sort of breaks up the 18th century or the 19th century status quo, right? The other one, and the one that's that we're using here, is simply post-medieval. The modern is the period that follows the medieval period. And in terms of the difference between them, we're kind of talking about a different outlook on reality. And it has to do with the view of history. So, first of all, there is a secularization of history. The Christian view of history, as epitomized by Augustine, consisted of what came to be called a sacred history, the history of the city of God, and a profane history, just what we today usually think of as history, political events and social developments in general, including religious movements, but not interpreted in light of religious ideas, right? One thing that carries over from Christianity is an idea of history as linear as opposed to cyclical. So the ancients, like Plato and Aristotle, saw history as cyclical. It's rise and fall of cities and nations and empires, and it wasn't really going anywhere. There might be moral advances, but then the cycle of that would end. There would be a process of corruption, and then it would start over. Things like that. With Christianity, history came to be seen as having a direction with a final endpoint. There will be an end of history, right? There was still somewhat of a cyclical notion about the earthly city, but the heavenly city was going somewhere, right? There was a destination beyond this world, and this idea of history kind of stuck. The idea of history as having a direction, had a movement, and therefore the talk about being on the right side of history and the wrong side of history, and so forth. Um, Along with this came an assumption of progress, and this was uh, similar to Christianity in one respect, but different in another. Similar in that uh, we were going to someplace better ultimately, um, but different in that the progress seen was not spiritual progress, um, but a progress in being able to make better use of the world for ordinary purposes of living. So, and this is often spoken of in terms of conquering nature. So, the most important expression of this was with Francis Bacon. Um, Francis Bacon, he's most famous for the term knowledge is power. And what he meant by that was that um, we want to gain knowledge, especially for the purpose of making use of the resources of nature for the betterment of human beings, and in particular the spirit, the material betterment, right? Increasing the standard of living in the modern sense, technological developments, and better political techniques to achieve um, better results, and so on. And this has been criticized even in the recent context. Environmentalists, for example, will talk about exploiting nature, right? Um, so there's a contrast to the ancients. I mean, nature was a standard of what we should become. You weren't trying to manipulate it or exploit it. You were trying to live up to it. Whereas nature is seen somewhat more as something hostile to be tamed and overcome for the moderns. And ultimately, this idea of conquering nature extends to human nature. Human nature itself is not static and fixed, but it can be uh, transformed potentially. Um, the most important expression of this comes from Rousseau. Rousseau talks in his discourse on inequality um, of something he calls the perfectibility of man. That um, what what distinguishes human beings from other animals is a capacity for self perfection and perfectibility, and this perfectibility is indefinite. There is no obvious end point. He contrasts this with Aristotle with his idea of nature as potentiality. Um, Potentiality implied a limit, right? If you have a definite, definable potential, that means well, you know when you've reached it, and when you've reached it, that's it, right? Um, so human beings could become the best things human beings could be, but what human beings could be in terms of their nature could not become something else. Otherwise, they would cease to be human. Um, you can't progress to being a god, for example. Human being can't become a dinosaur. There are certain natural uh, limits to human potentiality, and uh, this sense of limits is increasingly uh, rejected. But this still kind of goes along with the Christian idea of a transformation of reality. At the end, at the end of history, God is supposed to uh, return nature to its original state of paradise, in the garden with Adam and Eve. Um, Restoration of what nature as it was supposed to be. So, kind of a transformation in that sense. And moderns want to transform problematic aspects of nature and human nature uh, to achieve maybe if not a paradise, something much more satisfying. Um, So, what are the phases of history? If there's a periodization of history, what are the periods? Well, for the early moderns, uh, pretty basic. There was antiquity, there were the Middle Ages, and there was modernity. Right? Antiquity what meant pre-medieval, classic Greek, Roman, and Christian thinkers. You think of as far as the Christian thinkers, you think of Augustine. He's writing in the 400s. Most scholars would consider that still up in the period of antiquity, and this pre-Middle Ages still. Um, then the Middle Ages are just the period between antiquity and modernity, right? And so it presupposes the advent of modernity. Um, People in the Middle Ages didn't think of themselves as being in the middle of something, being in the middle of phases, right? I mean, from their perspective, they were modern in terms of recent, um, and they also didn't see themselves as discontinuous from um, the the period of antiquity. There wasn't a period of antiquity to them. It was just, the ancients to them, right? Um, so what is the advent of modernity then? It's typically marked, almost always marked, if not always, at the Renaissance and Reformation. Um, Renaissance means rebirth, right? And specifically, it was supposed to be a rebirth of antiquity. So this is one of the ironies of the early modern period. It's supposed to be a progression beyond something, but specifically, it's a progression beyond the Middle Ages and the um, supposedly uh, supposed regression that the Middle Ages represented. So we're going back to the classics, but we're using the classics for uh, application to modern problems, and in that sense, it's forward looking. But the period of antiquity was kind of idealized by people in the Renaissance. The Reformation too. Remember, the Reformation, Luther and company were trying to uh, get past the Catholic tradition, which was uh, especially medieval, the post uh, Augustinian period, and they wanted to go back to the early Christianity, which they associated as the way it should be. Let's go back to the scriptures. Let's go back to the early church fathers, and so forth. Um, but this also took a radically new direction in terms of, for example, a kind of individualism that was not typical of the early period. So there's that element of rebirth and redirection. Um, and as I just indicated, uh, the Middle Ages were seen by them to be um, a regression, and the term Dark Ages was often used. Um, this term is generally rejected now by historians because there are so many continuities uh, between the Middle Ages and the modern period, and there was a lot of going on in the Middle Ages in terms of advancements in science, development of capitalism, and so forth. And you could somewhat the term Dark Ages would somewhat fit with the early Middle Ages period, uh, but it was less really, I think, to be fair, a factor of uh, say, Christian dogma and so forth, and more of a factor of the breakdown of the Roman Empire and the chaos that ensued, constant invasions and conquest, so that people didn't have basic security, and therefore it couldn't couldn't get to the point of advancing in anything. Uh, the trouble was just preserving what they had, including preserving um, classics. Um, so so there's an element of looking down at the previous period. The modern is better than the period that preceded it, right? And thus this notion of progress. Um, if you wanted to talk about discontinuities between the modern and the medieval, you could point to a lot of you could call them revolutions. Um, Economic, for example. I mean, uh, capitalism really starts in the Middle Ages, but it really takes off in the medieval period. And you have a kind of globalization of, of economics with all the new trade routes, the routes around Africa to the east, discovery of the New World, and so forth, and the um, economic benefits for the homeland of uh, colonies and the process of colonization and so forth. And you could talk about a lot of other um, revolutions, military, scientific, educational, with the printing press and the increase of literacy, artistic. But I want to focus on three for our purposes. Um, First of all, religious. Uh, the Protestant break from the old church became pretty uh, thoroughgoing and complete church traditions of belief and practice, but many of them uh, radically rejected. So it really, Protestant Reformation really ought to be called the Protestant Revolution because it was um, revolutionary, and this changed a whole lot about life in the modern period. And one thing I might stress is that element of individualism. Um, you know, the individual believer's uh, direct relationship with God, right, as opposed to its mediation through church hierarchy, priesthood, and so forth. This lent itself to the modern tendency towards focus on the individual as opposed to the collective, you might say, right? Then there's a kind of a philosophical revolution, um, what we call humanism, right? And the previous period, the medieval period, it was a God-centric universe, and depictions of human beings in art, for example, stressed piety and otherworldliness and looking to God. All these images, people with halos and stuff, saintliness, and so forth. There's now a much more man-centric universe, human-centric universe, right? And a focus on human possibilities for improvement, uh, as opposed to the limitations imposed by sin and so forth. So, the possibility of human greatness, in other words, progress, right? And then political, the most directly relevant to us. Uh, in terms of political uh, arrangements, power structures, and so forth, you had a breakdown of Christendom um, in the late Middle Ages, and the kind of political chaos that followed. Nations now sort of dividing from nations and unique political identities um, forming, uh, breaking up the um, relative unity of Christian Europe. Um, Everybody sort of saw things the same way. The primary identity was religious as opposed to, say, national. Um, so that's all breaking down, and also critically, most critically for our purposes, um, you have a break from classical and Christian assumptions about human nature, about the possibilities of politics, and so forth. And here Machiavelli is the most decisive break in terms of he's the first great modern thinker, the first great political theorist to break. decisively from what I called earlier the Christian Aristotelian tradition, right? Um, and then modernity is kind of cemented in uh, what's called the Enlightenment, right? You had some big political developments that are important here. I mean, the American Revolution and the French Revolution um, revolutionized people's thinking about politics and the possibility of uh, change. And I mean, it's more radical in the French um, context. I mean, the thinking about change. Some people argued that the American Revolution was essentially conservative in a certain sense. They were trying to preserve what they already had, as opposed to, as in the French case, trying to throw out the old and bring in a completely new order. Um, but among some Americans, you saw it. I mean, look at Jefferson saying, "All eyes are opening to the rights of man," and um, and you see a change here in the American context in terms of the origination of the abolition movement um, and uh, the deliberate aim of at least evolving beyond slavery and getting rid of slavery. People like Jefferson, others, even slave owners like Jefferson, thought we need to gradually abolish slavery uh, because it's inconsistent with the rights of man. Right? And all this had a big impact on the way people thought about politics. The term enlightenment um, implies an emerging from darkness, right? And specifically, they thought of emerging from the darkness of dogma and superstition. Dogma, religious dogma, doctrines of the Catholic Church, and also philosophical dogma in the form of scholasticism was the culminating philosophical paradigm of the Middle Ages. Um, Scholasticism was the sort of product of what Thomas Aquinas wrought with uh, a an Aristotelian oriented uh, Christian understanding, and it had become uh, rather formalistic by the end of the Middle Ages. I mean, Thomas Aquinas's theory is quite original. The way he presents it, and the way, in terms of the insides and the philosophical penetration, it's it's still vital. But by the end of the medieval period, a, this kind of uh, vitality of thought is disappearing, and it seems more of a stultifying uh, than um, illuminating. And so, um, the way Kant put it, Kant wrote a famous essay, Immanuel Kant, called "What is Enlightenment?" And he defined it as emerging from our self-imposed immaturity. Self-imposed in terms of accepting these doctrines and superstitions um, that I spoke of. And the motto of the Enlightenment, he says, is dare to think for yourself. Don't take your orientation from tradition. Don't just start from what the church said or from what Aristotle said. Dare to think for yourself. Um, and and the inment part of enlightenment um, implied that this light was supposed to spread, right? Again, Jefferson, more and more eyes are opening to the rights of man. So, emerging from the darkness, spreading the light of rational understanding. But we should note that there were multiple enlightenments. To say the Enlightenment is misleading because the French version of the Enlightenment is quite different from the British version. Um, and the German version, and the American, which was mostly inspired by British thought, uh, especially Locke and the Scottish thinkers. The so-called Scottish Enlightenment was had a great impact, um, and uh, and one of the most significant differences between the French Enlightenment and these others, especially in the Scottish Enlightenment and the American Enlightenment, the American version, was a much greater friendliness towards religion. Um, the French philosophers, right, intellectuals, uh, were very often anti-Christian and even anti-religious in any kind of traditional sense, right? Um, Voltaire signed all his letters "Écraser l'infâme," which meant crush the infamy. The infamy he had in mind was the Catholic Church. We need to get rid of all that religious mumbo jumbo. It's holding us down and so forth. Um, and During the radical phase of the French Revolution, they actually turned the Cathedral of Notre Dame into the Temple of Reason, they called it. And instead of God sort of at the altar, it was reason with a capital R. And this points to certain Enlightenment assumptions um, that are central and that come to define modernity. The first one is what I've already mentioned several times: progress. Uh, and this included this sort of attitude of superiority to the past. Increasingly, not only superiority to people in the Middle Ages, but even to antiquity. Um, Modern is simply better. And as we dare to think for ourselves, uh, we're going to we're going to progress beyond anything that has been seen before. Right. Second, and related to this, is a notion of the power of human reason. We can figure it out ourselves. With the use of human reason, there's no limit to how far we can go. Right. Third was a kind of sense of a rational orderliness to the universe. That carries over from Christianity. Right. There's an order to the universe that is. This is true for the Greeks too. That is kind of normative. We need to sort of conform to the order of the universe, but it's um, it, it's increasingly sort of a despiritualized order for the moderns. But um, there's still a kind of impressive, uh, precise, uh, very clearly defined and clearly recognizable um, order to the universe. And Newton is a great sort of illustration of this. Isaac Newton, his picture of the universe, um, and so the sort of clean lines of order, as compared to what came later, people came to think later, uh, are are typical of the modern period. And related to what I just said about Newton, there was a tendency in the modern period to seek all encompassing, all explanatory principles. So, and Newton was massively influential here. Newton, uh, the fact that he was able to sort of describe all motion in the universe by one principle, the principle of gravity. And, wow, that's impressive, they thought. And people in the human sciences, um, the social sciences, started thinking, hey, what if we do that for uh, for human activity? What if we find one principle or just a couple of principles that explains everything? Well, that would really make it nice for analysis. So you get with Hobbes is probably the quintessential example here. Hobbes says, well, everything really boils down to the desire for power. Um, but in terms of human relations, this turns out to be a quest for self-preservation. So there's sort of anticipation of Darwin here. Um, right, but everything boils down to this, right? Whatever appearances might show, you can interpret all human behavior in terms of this. That's what's really going on. And in contrast to the ancients, here's, moderns tend to think of themselves as more sophisticated and see things as more complicated. Modernity is more complicated, so they think, than previous periods. But on this level, the ancients were much more uh, complicated in the sense that they thought there were many principles um, of human behavior and activity, and it couldn't be boiled down this way. Uh, it was too, from ancient perspectives, simplistic. Um, uh, One other thing about modernity, in particular in relation to modern political theory, that's worth noting is a tendency towards system building, trying to get the right system of ideas and the right political system. And the system becomes the most important thing, in a sense. For the ancients, it wasn't any kind of system. It was human character that was the essential thing. You got to get the soul right. You got to order the soul, and then things will tend to take care of themselves. The ordering of government and structuring of power was not unimportant and not to be considered, but it was decisively secondary to questions of uh, intellectual and moral formation of the individuals that make up society. Um, Whereas the tendency in moderns tended to be towards, if we can just get the right system, all our problems will be solved. Um, there's not this permanent problem of human corruptibility that we'll always have with us. Maybe with the right system, we can actually reshape mankind. And again, Hobbes is the quintessential example here. Hobbes tries to present a system of ideas that is sort of airtight, logically airtight, and resulting from that, a political system um, that is, there's one right way to do it. And if you just read my book and you internalize the principles of my book, um, you'll come up with a political system that, he uses the term, is potentially everlasting. Uh, so, kind of salvation by getting the right system, if you will. Okay, so a couple of last thoughts. It might help to have sort of to look at some competing views of modernity for perspective. So, the prevailing view, especially in the first period, what Strauss calls the first wave of modernity, was liberal. And in some ways, that is typified by Auguste Comte, C-O-M-T-E, French thinker. He categorized history, these phases of history take on different forms for a lot of different thinkers. And his categorization was, there's a theological period, there was a metaphysical period, and then there was the most progressive period, the scientific period. The theological period was people, for religious reasons, they saw the most important explanation of things in terms of invisible supernatural forces, right? And the metaphysical stage was a step beyond that because the focus was on nature and natural processes. But you still had a sort of lingering ghosts of invisible forces in the form of certain intangible principles that sort of were behind the whole thing. So you think of Plato's idea of the good, for example, the divine good. But then the scientific phase would overcome all of that foolishness to get down to brass tacks. The model of science became the natural scientific approach. The natural science is what we call the scientific method today. Um, what is scientific is what is uh, measurable and provable in material terms, right? Um, Intangibles like justice and so forth um, are not reliable science. That stuff really is just opinions. And this becomes known as positivism, uh, a sort of value-free science, or value-neutral sciences. The idea became that there are no hierarchy of values, such as Plato lays out in the Republic, um, but their um, values are just opinions. Strauss calls this the fact-value distinction. Uh, to be scientific means to leave your values at the lab room door, right? And just the facts. Values were not a fact. There were no objectively right values and so forth. This became the model of science, and it stuck. Um, so that's one way of looking at modernity. Straightforwardly positive, onward and upward to better things, right? There was a kind of optimism in especially the first distinctly liberal period of modern thought. I'll mention two others that are quite different. Um, One is by the 20th century philosopher Eric Voegelin. I mentioned to you in an email that I think Eric Voegelin and Leo Strauss are the most, the greatest modern political theorists, modern here in the sense of 20th century and beyond. But Voegelin understood modernity as a product of a secularizing Christianity. It's often said that liberalism is simply secularized Christianity, despiritualized Christianity, formalized Christianity, if you will. And and this uh, uh, so all of the elements of modernity are simply taken over from Christianity, and so contra compt, we're not overcoming all of that. All of that still persists, and in a form that is arguably uh, less vital in terms of shaping human beings. Um, um, uh, the kind of people we are um, than liberalism. So if you remind you of Vogelin's uh, presentation of Augustine's view of history, remember, there's a city of God, there's an earthly city, the city of God is going somewhere, there is ultimate destination, the destination is in the beyond this world. And Vogelin describes what's happening in the modern period as kind of this arrow is brought down here. So that instead of the paradise being somewhere else in the beyond, paradise is brought down here to earth to be achieved not through divine but through human means, and politically in terms of getting the right system or whatever. But we can bring it about ourselves. Um, he actually, the term, putting together some terms he used, um, it was called immanentizing the eschaton. Immanence meaning this worldly right. And eschaton was the Christian term for the final destination up here. Immanentizing the eschaton, bringing the eschaton down from heaven to earth. This is how Vogelin understood modernity, what's essentially really going on. Leo Strauss, a little different. He said he interpreted it in terms of what he called natural right and history. The title of Strauss's most famous book is Natural Right and History, and he saw the development in modernity in terms of a movement from um, away from the original natural right understanding of the ancients, which was there is an order of nature that determines what is right. There is a right by nature. It's not made by man. It's it's beyond man and includes man. But human beings cannot uh, create justice. That whatever they call justice and whatever political institutions and laws they make are subject to critique by appeal to a higher standard. Right. In the modern period, natural right becomes more secularized and becomes and takes a different um, meaning. So Hobbes totally redefines natural right to mean something actually opposite to what the ancients meant by it. Right by nature, for Hobbes, was uh, the the power to do whatever is necessary to survive in the state of nature. Um, so, and that meant killing people, enslaving people, whatever, because there's no natural justice. Justice for Hobbes is simply man-made. Justice is keeping the contracts that man makes. Um, and uh, and Locke and other contract theorists take the sort of conceptual uh, framework of Hobbes and do different things with it. But they too define natural right and natural law in somewhat different ways. Um, and so there's this sort of development of thinking about natural right, Strauss says. And then there's ultimate movement away from the idea of natural right altogether and towards a historicism, understanding everything in terms of historical context, and everything is changed. And if there is a notion of truth that um, sort of is still held to, it's a kind of called organic truth. It's a truth relative to the time, and there are no timeless truths. Um, and and where this ends is with postmodernity. The postmoderns, right? They consider themselves as getting beyond problems with modernity and the modern outlook, um, and and so this is one very thoroughgoing questioning of modernity. One form of it is postmodernism, and in particular, the postmodernists question modern assumptions about rationality and truth. Um, there was a turn to narrative analysis and critique. We have to understand we can't really know reality. There's no sort of ultimate objective standards at all. There's no such thing as truth except in this maybe relative sense. And so the best we can do is sort of analyze the narratives people tell about themselves and to see if they're coherent and so on. And one leading feature of postmodernism is a often searing critique of Eurocentrism and Westernism, um, and uh, and the Enlightenment narrative is rejected, and new narratives replace it. And ironically, these narratives sort of imply some kind of moral judgment, because increasingly the, the the most valid narratives, uh, there's an idea of valid versus invalid narratives. Um, the sort of true narrative, to speak ironically, uh, is various forms of oppression narratives. So, started with Marx, there's one class all through history. There's always one class that dominates another class. There's an oppressor and oppressed. And this gets expanded later into categories of race and sex or gender and so forth. but oppression narratives become sort of the outstanding feature of postmodern uh, discourse. There's one other way uh, that modernity has been questioned, and that is by people like Strauss and Vogelin, um, who really argue two things that I think are important for us to consider. One is, and I think this part is inarguable, that we have to read and study the ancients, both in antiquity and in the so-called Middle Ages, to understand the moderns, because the moderns define themselves in relation to that early period, either building on it, trying to overcome it, or whatever reaction they had. They define themselves in relation to the pre-modern, and so you can't adequately understand the moderns themselves unless you understand the ancients. And so studying the ancients is necessary, but more to the point here, in terms of the critique of modernity, the ancients, they thought, offered a viable alternative way of looking at the world to modernity and post-modernity. That is, they're different, but contrary to these later assumptions, they're not necessarily superseded. Or they may be superseded in practice, but in theory, they may be better, at least in some ways, than the modern and postmodern ways of looking at things. We can only determine that by reading them, studying them, and taking seriously what they say, and then weighing it against the modern and postmodern arguments. So, so that's why the way Strauss puts this is studying the history of political philosophy in terms of the most profound and influential text of political philosophers, all the way through from the early so Plato to the present. Okay, I think that's enough to get a firm grasp on what we mean by modernity. Next, we'll turn to Machiavelli.